The next speaker is Dr. David Katz, the founding director of Yale University's Yale Griffin Prevention Research Center, current president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and founder of the Global True Health Initiative. He's published roughly 200 scientific articles and textbook chapters and 15 books to date. He's recognised globally for expertise in nutrition, weight management, and the prevention of chronic disease. David's here tonight to answer the question, if lifestyle is the medicine, what is the spoon?
Because those who preceded me up here this evening gave a deep dive and many wonderful insights, I think effectively they provided the pearls. I just have to string them. So if you will, my job here at the end is to provide the view from altitude, the big picture, the context. They're the tree experts. I'm here to talk about the forest. Or if you will, one final metaphor, the elephant in the room. And so my job is the easy one, and yet even so, I've brought along help to do it. 6 old friends, to be exact. It was 6 men of Indistan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out an eager hand and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain," quoth he. "'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "In the blindest man can tell what this resembles most, deny the fact who can. This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, then seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Indistan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. So oft in theologic wars the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about the elephant not one of them has seen. My friends, I think we're prone to much the same tendency in epidemiology, nutritional epidemiology in particular, and my mission here this evening is to try and convey a clearer vision of the big picture. So we have already met the elephant in the room. Let's talk about the dark wood, the promise, the problem, and the other problem. Come to a fork in the road and take it. Have recourse to the right metaphor. Try to get traction with sandbagging. Make a case for having our cake and eating it too. Make use of the big spoon. Return to the fork in the road. And ideally get out of the woods for having seen the forest through the trees. Are there any questions at all? Thank you and good night. The dark wood I have in mind is the dark wood of modern epidemiology, where chronic diseases kill people. And because they're chronic diseases, they don't just take years from our lives. First, they take life from our years. And for a long time now, when we enumerate the list of leading causes of premature death, inevitably we cite heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, respiratory diseases. This is the list that we have tossed at one another for decades. It's appropriate now. It will be the list into the foreseeable future, but for the fact that there's a different way of looking at this altogether. There's a way of looking at this through the lens of lifestyle medicine. And I think one of the more seminal papers in the history of modern medicine was written in 1993 by Bill Foege and Mike McGinnis, entitled "Actual Causes of Death in the United States." Now, of course, in this particular venue, in the United States is unfortunate. It might just as well have been in the modern world, because frankly, this was the issue in the modern world. McGinnis and Foege in akin with Dr. Egger, recognized that causes have causes and those two have causes. And they said, you know, what we typically refer to as the causes of premature death, the diseases listed on death certificates, are not causes at all. They are effects. And what we really want to know is effects of what? What has caused the chronic diseases that cause the premature deaths? They got their arms around the relevant data, wrestled them all under control, and in 1993 published a paper which elucidated a list of 10 factors which collectively accounted for virtually all of the premature deaths every year in the United States at the time, but for a rounding error. And again, much the same would be true in Australia and frankly throughout the developed world. And while the full list of 10 is interesting and important and includes things like how we drive our cars and the use of guns and exposure to environmental toxins and the importance of alcohol, we can focus this evening preferentially on just the first 3 entries, because the first 3 things on McGinnis and Feege's list accounted for 80% of the premature deaths every year in the United States as of 1990. Just these 3 things. And they were in order: tobacco use, poor diet, and lack of physical activity, or as I like to call them, bad use of feet, forks, and fingers. 80% of the premature deaths occurring in our country every year. Just those 3 things. The only problem with this epiphany is it's getting to be a bit old, but no worries, we have fresher data. 10 years later, scientists at the CDC reanalyzed this issue, reaching substantially the same conclusion. All that had really changed in the decade is that the gap between tobacco as the #1 cause of premature death and the combination of bad use of feet and forks as #2 had narrowed because we were smoking less. That was the good news. But also because of deteriorating use of our forks, degenerating use of our feet, and worsening epidemics of obesity and diabetes to show for it. This then was the dark wood of modern epidemiology in 2004, also an old vintage. You may like your data fresher. We can jump ahead to 2009. Earl Ford and colleagues conducted research among 23,000 adults in and around Potsdam, Germany. They asked these 23,000 people about 4 factors affecting their health. They asked, do you smoke, yes or no? Do you eat well, yes or no? And let's pause there just long enough to say that the definition of eating well was habitual intake of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. No arcana regarding the ratio of this fatty acid to that fatty acid, nothing about gluten or genetically modified ingredients, nothing in particular about the degree of processing, just habitual intake of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. That was eating well, and failing to do that was eating less well, and it was enough. It was enough. Enough for what? Stay tuned. So do you smoke, yes or no? Do you eat well? That definition, yes or no? Are you active every week, yes or no? And is your weight in a healthy place, yes or no? And what they went on to do was compare the 2 ends of the spectrum. They compared, I don't smoke, I eat well, I'm active, my weight is fine, to I smoke, eat badly, don't exercise, my weight is out of control. These people, over the entire span of the study, had an 80% lesser rate of all major chronic disease than these people. Flip the switch from bad to good on any one of these factors, and the likelihood of developing any major chronic disease was reduced about 50%, but fire on all 4 cylinders. And the probability of developing any major chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, was slashed a stunning 80%. Imagine if the news were to break tomorrow, Anya might report it, there's a new drug available, by prescription presumably, approved by the federal agencies, shockingly inexpensive, stunningly free of side effects, safe enough for children and octogenarians alike, and taken once daily for the rest of your life, will reduce your risk of ever getting any major chronic disease by 80%. Who would not be calling in for a prescription? Who would not be buying stock in the company selling the stuff? Both would be excellent ideas. Take the drug, buy the stock. But for the fact that there is no such pill. And in my opinion, there never will be any such pill. But lifestyle is exactly that medicine, and we've known about it since 1993 at least, perhaps decades longer than that, and arguably all the way back to the wisdom of Hippocrates. In any event, if you don't like Potsdam for some reason or prefer fresher data still, these findings were reaffirmed in a cohort study in the UK by Kavavic et al., attribution, oops. Several years later by McCullough et al. In the US. And frankly, this is one of the more impressive repetitive drumbeats in all of the peer-reviewed literature. This 80% control over the development of chronic disease is repeated in the literature again and again and again. And the beat of this drum reverberates to our very pith and marrow, to within the double helix of DNA itself. In this study by my friend Dean Ornish and colleagues, they enrolled 30 men with early-stage prostate cancer, amenable to watchful waiting. But rather than just watch and wait and see if the cancer progressed, Dr. Ornish and colleagues gave these men lifestyle as medicine while waiting and watching. They gave them optimal plant-based nutrition, routine physical activity, obviously no tobacco, and in addition, good sleep, helped them dissipate their stress, and encourage strong social interactions. Or as I like to call this recipe, feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love. That is the six-cylinder engine of lifestyle as medicine. They fired on all six, and over a span of months went on to study not so much the men and not so much the cancer in the men, but preferentially the genes in the men with the cancer. And what they found is that 500 cancer promoter genes were turned off, were dramatically downregulated in their expression by this lifestyle intervention, and 50 cancer suppressor genes were dramatically turned up. And here we see red is off, green is on, left is before, right is after. And these are cancer suppressor genes being dramatically upregulated by this lifestyle intervention. The power of lifestyle as medicine is such that it can refashion our fate at the very level of our DNA. And this is not just one study, of course. It's a branch of the literature filling up fast. And we have evidence as well that probably the most robust biological marker we have of the length of our lives is directly influenced by lifestyle. Evidence that lifestyle practices can change the length of telomeres, these protective caps at the end of chromosomes, which correlate powerfully with the length of life itself. And this is research associated with a Nobel Prize in medicine. So I think the case can be made, and this is the good venue to make it, that the master levers of medical destiny are nothing at the cutting edge of technological advance. They are not PET or SPECT or fMRI. They are not the tools of the clinical trade, not the stethoscopes we drape over our shoulders, nothing we carry through the corridors of hospitals. The master levers of medical destiny have been in your hands all along. They're what each of us manages to do every day with our feet, our forks, and our fingers. And I trust you know what Archimedes said about a lever. Give me one long enough and I could move the whole world. Make no mistake, these levers are long enough and should long since have served to move the whole world of modern public health and epidemiology to a better place. But alas, we like to say knowledge is power. Would that it were so. The gap between what we know and what we do with what we know belies that wishful thinking. So we have looked on collectively at a luminous opportunity to improve the human condition, to add years to lives and life to years, be squandered for decades, not in translation, but in the lack thereof. The failure to translate what we know into what we as a culture routinely do with what we know. And the cost of the status quo is staggering. These maps, bless you, show the trends in obesity in the US with color change. All color change is bad because, as Gary said, those of us working in the obesity prevention field pretty much suck. Nothing we have done to date works. So things have only gotten worse since we got started. This is 1985. This is 1995. This is 2010. Here's 2013. And then, hot off the press, is a full issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association associated to the latest obesity trends, and all the news is bad. It continues to rise in most demographic groups, and the rates of rise are greater in much of the world than they are in the US at this point. And this matters. I use the canary in a coal mine reference as well, but for a different purpose. just that obesity is a harbinger of what is to come. When it starts to suggest illness is coming, it is a whole tidal wave of illness coming. Obesity is linked to the development of heart disease, cancer, degenerative arthritis, stroke, dementia, the slings and arrows of outrageous epidemiologic misfortune, and most indelibly, obesity is linked to the development of type 2 diabetes. So the trends there, here we have 1994 to 2010, are in lockstep with the trends in obesity, and predictably so. And we're getting nervous that although we've been in the frying pan for quite some time, we're headed toward the fire. We have projections in the US that by the middle of this century, should current trends persist, 1 in 3 of us will be diabetic. Now that would be 100 million people with diabetes. We have 28 million people with diabetes now, and we can't pay the bills. We've had data come in to suggest we are heading toward that target. We have reason to believe that the mortality impact of obesity is greater than previously recognized and rising through time as we get closer to birth cohorts near the present. Rates of diabetes are not just rising, they're rising especially fast in young people. And oops, it won't be 30% of us who have diabetes by mid-century. The updated projection is that it may be 40% of us, and 1 in 2 in certain ethnic minority groups. And again, these are the statistics in the US. They're actually worse in a number of places around the world. We perhaps were the epicenter of this problem, but we've exported it so effectively, other countries have statistics worse than these. Now, 40% of people, 50% of people in a society having a chronic, costly, often disabling condition is crippling for the economy of a country. I submit to you that should this come to pass, the United States of America will be insolvent. And the same thing would happen here in Australia. But frankly, the economic cost is a matter of interest to economists. I went into medicine because I'm a humanist. It's the human cost of this that keeps me up at night. We are looking at nothing less in our failure to use lifestyle as medicine routinely in our culture than bequeathing to our children and grandchildren a blighted future, because they will be these adults in 2050. Half of them will be diabetic, and they'll get it at ever younger age. They will be left to deal with the economic consequences of it. And so these trends simply cannot continue. This cannot come to pass. And yet the writing is on the wall with regard to the fate of children. We have already seen in the US a 35% increase in the rate of stroke among 5 to 14-year-olds. Even as the rate of stroke is declining in those over 50 due to better detection and treatment of hypertension, and the only smoking gun on the scene to account for this is epidemic childhood obesity, something that we could commit to eradicating as a culture by making routine use of feet and forks a priority. And we are beginning to worry that this projection made in 2005 about a truncated life expectancy for the generations to follow us is in fact coming true. Life expectancy itself weighed down by epidemic obesity, poor diet, lack of physical activity. Now, folks, I apologize. That's a somewhat lugubrious start to a talk, but I told you it was a dark wood. Or maybe the dark clouds above the wood, which begs the question, what then of a silver lining? And I'm pleased to report it's there and every bit as luminous as the clouds are dark. What if lifestyle were our medicine and routinely accessible? What if we came together in our collective righteous might and said, enough, enough marketing multicolored marshmallows to kids as part of a complete breakfast. Enough hyper-processing, hyper-palatable junk food and pretending it's good because this week it's gluten-free. Last week it was low-carb. The week before that it was low-fat. Lipstick on a pig all. Enough. What if we just said, enough? It's time to take this seriously. We're talking about years in lives, life in years, the future we bequeath our children. Let's fix this. What then? What if good use of feet, forks, and fingers prevailed? Well, in that world, I could say to you, we could eradicate 80% of heart disease or more. We could eliminate up to 90% of diabetes. Forget about going from 28 million diabetics to 128 million diabetics, we could eliminate 90% of the 28 million cases of diabetes we have right now. Those people don't need to have diabetes. We could eliminate up to 60% of the world's burden of cancer. I could say this to you in a world where lifestyle is medicine, and I could cite the peer-reviewed literature to back me up. And in fact, you know what? I am saying this to you. I am citing the literature to back me up. I'd like to know if this particular slide has brought a tear to any eye in the room. A lump to any throat, perhaps? Tearless, lumpless, insensitive bastards. Well, I doubt it. I met a whole bunch of you before we got started this evening. You seem very nice. I think the problem must be my slide. You see, these are stunning statistics. Among the most stunning in the history of public health and certifiably true. They're not even contentious. But at the end of the day, they are still just statistics. And perhaps this gets to some of the points Anya was making about communication. Because statistics are dull, dry, bland, and most importantly, anonymous. I've worked in public health most of my career and long since come to recognize that this endeavor is potentially crippled by a fiction. Because there is no public. The public is nameless, the public is faceless, the public is impossible to love. There is no public. There's just you and me and everybody else. And I'm counting on you to help demonstrate that here in this room. If you or someone you love, exclusively you or someone you love, has been touched by heart disease, would you mind raising your hand and keep it in the air? If you or someone you love has been touched by cancer, please add your hands to those already in the air. Stroke, diabetes, add your hands. Look around the room. All of us. All of us. And now conjure to your mind's eye the face of the person you love who made you raise your hand, and remember the day you got that news. However it played out. You were right there, you called the ambulance, you rode in the ambulance, you were far away, you got a phone call, an email, a text. You saw them in the ER, the ICU, the CCU. They got better and came home. They never did. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. But however it played out for you, it was a bad day. We've all been through them. And what it means is those 4 leading chronic diseases have invaded all of our homes and all of our families. And in a world where lifestyle is medicine and routinely accessible as such, and 80% of the total global burden of chronic disease is eliminated, 8 out of 10 of us in this room would not have had cause to raise our hands because those bad days would not have happened. That's what an 80% reduction in chronic disease would feel like. It's not remote. It's not statistically anonymous. It's not about some public we don't know. When we part the veil of statistical anonymity, the faces we see looking back at us are the faces of people we know and the faces of people we love. It is for them that the promise of this must be kept. It is for them that the miles of translation of what we know into what we do, however arduous, must be traversed. And all of this, I think, begs the question. Since we've had the knowledge for decades, and we all have the basis for passion, literal skin in the game, the skin of people we love, what the hell is the problem? Why haven't we just gotten this job done? Well, it might be this spaghetti monster, the chart that we saw twice, that it's very complicated. But I'm going to suggest that the problem is in some ways fairly simple. In essence, if you take this and you add this, you pretty inevitably wind up with this. In much the same way as if you took this and added this, you would get this. And I give you my figurative trademark for the better part of 25 years now, the polar bear in the Sahara. Now, my point in this slide is not about climate change. You'll have to invite Al Gore to the next one of these. It'll be an evening with Al Gore and friends. He'll tell you all about that, although we will return to climate change before I'm done. My point is about adaptation, and I think actually it fits in well with the opening comments this evening. We are creatures. We are adapted to a particular environment. We recognize that with all other creatures. We overlook it in ourselves. Polar bears are marvels of survival, beautifully adapted to one of the Earth's harshest climates, but adapted to that particular climate. And the very traits and tendencies that foster your survival in the Arctic cold would conspire against you beneath the burning Sahara sun in summer. I've taken on an echo, right? I don't know if that's me or if it's the microphone. My point with this slide is that effectively we are polar bears in the Sahara. Throughout most of human history, calories were relatively scarce and hard to get, and physical activity was unavoidable. It did not require gym membership, specialized footwear, or protein powders. It was called survival, and everybody just did it every day. We have devised a modern world where physical activity is scarce and hard to get, and calories are unavoidable. Houston, we have a problem. And Sydney, and every place in between. I submit to you that as a species, we have no native defenses against caloric excess or the law of the couch, never having needed them before. No native defenses save one, the very one that got us into this mess in the first place, great big Homo sapien brains. We are arguably smarter than the average bear and can think our way out of this mess of our own devising. And that's just what we need to do. There are two challenges. The first is it may feel like you can't get there from here. I think you can. I used the metaphor of a levee and a flood. I think we're up against a flood of factors conspiring against our health. They are throughout our culture, a flood of highly processed, hyper-palatable, energy-dense, nutrient-dilute, glow-in-the-dark, bet you can't eat just one kind of foods. A constant flow of marketing dollars encouraging us and our children to eat the very foods in the very quantities that propel us toward obesity and chronic disease. Wave after wave of technological advance, usually where invention is the mother of necessity, giving us gadgets and gizmos that do all the things muscles used to do at work and at play. A great big obesogenic flood. If we want to contain those floodwaters, we need something like a levee. I like it. It fits. I also like it because it keeps Gary and me and others going when we feel like failures, because we think, well, every day we can be part of the solution, stack another sandbag, or we can abdicate, give up, and be part of the problem. We want to be part of the solution, and I think we share the belief that we'll win in the end. We're just not there yet. Just like when you stack the first sandbags, the ground at your feet doesn't dry out right away. You've got to build the whole levee. And finally, I like the levee metaphor as a precautionary tale because it tells us whether the problem is complex or simple, it's comprehensive. It's throughout our culture. And there is no one little thing we're going to do that's going to fix it all. That would be like putting down one sandbag and asking, are we dry yet? And the answer would be no, and not because the sandbag is a bad sandbag, but because no sandbag can do what a whole levee can do. We need a whole levee. We need an array of solutions throughout our culture and clinics that are commensurate with the challenge we face. And it's this thinking that has turned me into a sandbagger. This is actually what I do. We could abbreviate my bio. He's a sandbagger. Welcome him here this evening. Proud of it. This is my vocation. Manufacture, test, stack, and as appropriate, attempt to disseminate sandbags. Now, this evening is not the time to go through an inventory of the sandbags we've developed at my shop over the years. There are a number, and I'm proud of them, and most are available free to populations around the world. But I will mention that the proposition here is not about helping people get to health by giving up pleasure, but rather to empower people to enjoy the pleasure of living well and enjoying vitality and health. Healthy people have more fun. They have more fun. I think that's part of the message that often drops out. There's a certain moralizing about lifestyle as medicine. Stop flashing that clock at me. And by the way, don't you know you should take good care of yourself because that's what good people do? I think it kind of goes in that general direction. And missing from that, that's right, you show me the clock. It's all right. I didn't mean to scare you. But on the other hand, I don't intend to let you scare me either. Healthy people have more fun. I think that's crucial. And so what we're really trying to do with a lot of the sandbags we've developed, and many others are in this business, is to help people do things like love the food that loves them back. So one of the recent additions to our anti-obesity, anti-chronic disease levee is my wife's beautiful recipe site, Cuisinicity, where all of the Katz family greatest hits are being paid forward. Beautiful French Mediterranean-inspired cuisine, strong plant-centric shift. And here, you can quite literally have your cake and eat it too. This recipe is featured on the Cuisinicity site. It's as delicious as it looks. Features as a signature ingredient black beluga lentils, probably the most nutritious chocolate cake you'll ever try. And there are instructional videos of Catherine, who's here in the audience this evening, showing you how she makes these things. Folks, this is one of those you can and should try at home. And you should because it's fun. Tastes great, family friendly. You can make this at home. You can love food that loves you back. And it's just an example of a sandbag in the levee. If people need to learn how to cook, let's help them. But we have another problem to wrestle with in the time remaining to us this evening. It's not just a question of can we get there from here, but do we even know where there is? Because you can't get there from here if you don't know where there is. Well, I told you I think feet, forks, and fingers are the master levers of medical destiny. So with regard to fingers, smoking is bad, not smoking is better. Any argument? Thank God. Okay. Feet, using them is good. Sitting on our asses all the time, not so much. Any argument there? We're good again. But forks, there's the rub. Because someone comes along to tell us the new right way to eat pretty much every damn day. And they don't just tell us that they figured it out. They also tell us that everybody who came before was a moron, and they throw them under the bus, right? And in particular of late, we have witnessed the sat-fat shuffle, with everybody telling us saturated fat is good for us now, and they tend to quote the Siri-Torino meta-analysis from 2010, or they quote the Chowdhury meta-analysis from 2014, and both of these found that across the spectrum of saturated fat intake, rates of heart disease were pretty much the same. And therefore, saturated fat is good for us now. Doesn't that follow logically? Maybe not. More importantly, the Siri-Torino meta-analysis from 2010 concluded with this statement: we really ought to look at what people are eating instead. That's what this translates to. That's the non-scientific version of this line, right? So did the later meta-analysis look at what people were eating instead? No. And in fact, I searched that entire paper for the word sugar, the possibility that people were replacing saturated fat with sugar. The word sugar does not appear once in that paper. That's amazing, really is amazing. Fortunately, we have a new paper to talk about that does look at what is replacing the sat-fat calories, but we might have guessed way back in 2010 when we heard higher, lower intake of saturated fat, no differences in heart disease. If people were eating less pepperoni, what were they eating more of? Broccoli? Lentils? Kale? Hell no. Snackwells. Low-fat junk food, right? I mean, this wasn't rocket science. We know how people roll. All right, so Lee and colleagues at Harvard came along and they actually analyzed what happens when people replace saturated fat calories with different things. When they replace sat-fat calories with trans-fat calories, things go from bad to worse. Even higher rates of heart disease. When they replace sat-fat calories with added sugar, refined carbohydrate, Snackwell cookies, for instance, pretty much constant rates of cardiovascular disease, driven by metabolic syndrome, diabetes. When they replace sat-fat calories with either whole grain calories or unsaturated fat calories from nuts, seeds, olive oil, avocado, fish, seafood, rates of heart disease drop dramatically and significantly, which is pretty much what I think we thought we knew before we got confused again, right? And then this just in from friends at Harvard, they looked at variation in all of the dietary fats and total and cause-specific mortality. And this had a stunning 3.5 million person years of observation. And they found higher intake of saturated fat from the usual sources, pepperoni, pizza, processed ice cream, and so forth, higher rates of heart disease. The higher the intake of unsaturated fats, nuts, seeds, olive oil, avocado, fish, seafood, the lower the rates of cardiovascular disease. Again, when you look from altitude at the big picture, we have not reversed ourselves What we thought we knew on the basis of both science and sense is what we still think we know on the basis of science and sense. And by the way, we never reduced our intake of fat in the first place. Actually, in the US, and it's pretty similar around the world where it's been tracked, animal fat intake stayed constant over decades, vegetable oil intake went up, total fat intake went up. How can total fat intake go up and yet it looks like it's going down? Well, we measure it as a percent of total calories. Easy breezy. You just have to increase your intake of total calories so much that fat as a percent of calories goes down a little bit. We can do that. That's what we did. That's exactly what we did. So we have data to show, yes, we actually increased our intake of fat, but we increased our intake of other stuff more. Wasn't that what we were supposed to do? So keep eating the pepperoni pizza, but eat lots of Snackwell cookies, and all will be well. And we're supposed to be surprised that we haven't solved the obesity and chronic disease epidemics. By the way, if you're interested in changes in typical dietary intake in the US over the past 40 years, and I don't know if there's a similar flow diagram for Australia, it'd be really great if there is, but this is terrific. It's an animated diagram that shows you change by food category over 40 years. So you can either write down this URL or just remember American diet changes, Vox, and you just Google that, and this flow diagram comes right up. It's very cool. Okay, moving on. We even know why we've been eating more of everything. Many people have told us, but none ever better than Michael Moss, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who wrote a terrific book called Salt, Sugar, Fat. He's due out with his next book called Hooked soon. But in this New York Times Magazine cover story, he describes the fact that all of the big food companies around the world hire teams of PhDs, give them functional MRI machines and marching orders to design food we can't stop eating, to exploit those Stone Age vulnerabilities. Put in here the stuff so that nobody can eat just one. Remember, did you have that ad campaign from Lay's potato chips here too? Nobody, bet you can't eat just one? Is that familiar? Yeah? That was a threat. Right? And they knew they could back it up with data from functional MRI machines directed at the human hypothalamus. What do we need to put in this stuff? And by the way, food scientists have collaborated with tobacco scientists in this work because they both share the functional MRI machines. Tobacco scientists want to know what flavorants do we put into cigarettes to get young people hooked. Food scientists want to know what do we put into food so people can't stop eating it. This is what's going on. And by the way, for those of you concerned that we lost our way and started talking about cutting fat and ignored sugar, right? Haven't we ignored sugar? No, we never ignored sugar. There have been dietary guidelines in the United States for about 40 years. The first official dietary guidelines came out in 1980. This is them. 7 highlighted key points. Number 5, avoid too much sugar. We've been talking about sugar for 40 years, but nobody's listening any more than they listened with cut fat. Nobody ever cut fat. They just added Snackwell. So, you know, if the message gets that badly garbled, it doesn't much matter what the hell the message was, right? We're doing it wrong. People, we're doing it wrong, okay? We've got to do it right. All of this, I think, leads to this question: what to trust about food? What were you thinking it meant? Anyway, we come to a fork in the road. Along one time, we remain forever befuddled about the basic care and feeding of Homo sapiens and never sort this out. I'd like to propose an alternative. I'd like to think that I can address this with some reasonable authority. I've written 3 editions of a nutrition textbook, wrote this article, and you know, some of you, when we were meeting and greeting at the beginning, were very kind and said you read my blogs. I'm particularly proud of this review paper I was asked to write. Now, it didn't go viral. I don't have 29 million views, but this review paper at the top here, can we say what diet is best for health? It's been downloaded over 95,000 times. That's not bad for a peer-reviewed paper, right? So it seems to have touched a nerve. You can download the PDF for free, and it's an attempt to look at this issue of diet from altitude. I have not, however, relied on just myself. And some of you were writing it down. It's just, can we say what diet is best for health in my name? And it'll come up on Google. But a number of people are looking at this issue. I particularly want to acknowledge Frank Hugh at Harvard, who is a member of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. He's written great papers on this. And we've all pretty much reached the same conclusion. When you look without bias at the literature for and against low-fat diets, for and against vegan diets, for and against low-glycemic diets, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, the diabetes prevention program, paleo diets, low-carb diets, Mediterranean diets, maybe not the Twinkie diet, but all the reasonable contenders for best diet laurels. What we hear about in the media all the time is my diet can beat your diet. Try this one this week. When in fact, what really matters about good diets is what makes them good diets, and that's not really what makes them different from one another. It's what they have in common. It's the olive in the middle, nicely skewered by Michael Pollan, who was acknowledged earlier this evening when he said eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Now, admittedly, that's a bit vague. It leaves something to the imagination, but frankly, that's what we know with great conviction, that basic theme of healthy eating. And we reached the same conclusion in the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. It took 572 pages, but this is government work. What are you going to do? I was privileged to co-chair a conference last November in Boston with Walter Willett, where we convened dietary experts across disciplines from around the world, and this Old Ways Common Ground conference reached pretty much the same conclusion. And here's a beautiful thing. I'm going to pay some attention to you, but I'm going to need a little bit of latitude. Here's a beautiful thing. I had begun to worry that having gone into lifestyle medicine, because I was interested in being where the action is and addressing the big issue of my time, chronic disease, epidemic obesity, I had in fact missed the big issue of my time. Because as concerned as I am about the fate of people, I'm beginning to be more concerned about the fate of the planet. And I thought, I'm helping to keep alive longer the very species that's destroying the planet. Maybe I'm on the wrong team. Fortunately, everything we're trying to do in lifestyle medicine is totally confluent with the well-being of the planet. A shift to more plant-based diets, less processed food, water when thirsty. Do you know that it takes about 600 liters of water to produce 1 liter of Coca-Cola in a plastic bottle? About 2/3 of it to make the Coke, the remaining third to make the plastic bottle. We should get over the plastic bottle issue, clearly. Too many of those. Get a water bottle, carry it around. But drink water. Just for the environmental impact, drink water. If you don't care about sugar and calories, if you're not worried about diabetes, drink water anyway. 600 liters to make 1 liter. It's crazy, right? So highly confluent, what we need to do for ourselves and the planet. And there are academic programs increasingly devoted to this issue, like this environmental nutrition program at Loma Linda University. So with all of these good reasons, are we eating a less processed diet of mostly plants? Hell no. This is the typical American diet. I don't know that Australia is much better. This is from the book Hungry Planet, What the World Eats. It's a family and their food for a week, and a lot of this stuff looks like it would glow in the dark. We've got a long way to go. So even when it's clear where there is, and I think it's perfectly clear where there is, it may seem that it's hard to get there from here. In other words, we know that lifestyle is the very best of medicine. The problem it doesn't solve is, how do we get the medicine to go down? Lord knows the last thing we need is more spoonsful of sugar. But we need something. I think we can begin by acknowledging that in general, what we call the healthcare system doesn't make health, right? It treats disease. That's a noble calling. But if we want to make health, we have to apply an influence elsewhere. We have to influence what people do every day. Health is made where people live and love and learn and work and pray and play. It's the stuff that fills up the days and minutes and weeks and years of a life, not the intermittent clinical visit. On the other hand, clinicians are part of the solution, encouraging this healthy lifestyle, or they're missing the action and part of the problem. So one of the sandbags in our levee is an online counseling program, lifestyle behavior modification program for clinicians. And how many physicians in the group tonight? 4 hours of Category 1 CME credit for physicians for free from Yale University called OUCH, Online Weight Management Counseling for Healthcare Professionals. And this is based on 15 years of work in our lab to translate behavior modification models to the clinical setting. This program is freely available online. Just Google OUCH, O-W-C-H program. You can pull it up. But frankly, I think that what we can do in medicine is important but limited. I think what we really want with lifestyle is for it to encourage health all around us so that people simply need less medicine. So I'm here largely because I currently hold the office for a few more months of president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I have pretty much devoted my tenure as president to the proposition in prepositions. There's lifestyle in medicine, what clinicians can do in those individual encounters, or group encounters, better. But there's lifestyle as medicine, where we come together, exert a collective influence, and change our culture. If lifestyle is the medicine, the big spoon is culture. We need a big spoon. And the evidence we have of what a big spoon can do is demonstrated by the great achievements of humanity when committed to something. We got to the moon. We put footprints and a flag on the moon. And as best I know, we got there for 3 reasons. We wanted to go. We're an ingenious species. We knew where to find the damn thing. Well, I think we want to go to a world with 80% less chronic disease. We're still an ingenious species. If we could simply rally around the fact that we know where there is, we would have all 3 key components of that recipe. It would at least make it possible. What makes it impossible to get there from here is for those of us working to fight the problem to be bailing with pipettes while the forces in our culture are flooding the lifeboat with a fire hose. I don't know if you've got Lucky Charms cereal here in Australia, but you got something like it. I'm sure you have your own version of multicolored marshmallows as part of a complete breakfast, fortified with 11 essential vitamins and minerals, right? Yeah, it's the shitty part of a complete breakfast. We should not be peddling this stuff to kids, but we are. Lifestyle is medicine. Culture is the spoon. And the evidence we have of what it can do when culture gets it right is brought to us courtesy of the world's blue zones. Those 5 places around the world described by National Geographic fellow Dan Buettner, where people most routinely live to be 100. They don't get chronic disease. They don't succumb to dementia. They remain vital. And then one night at 102, they go to sleep and just don't wake up. They check out peacefully. They go gentle into that good night. They live long. They prosper with vitality. A peaceful exit. It doesn't get better than that. What do they get right? In all 5 of the identified blue zones to date, Sardinia, Italy, Ikaria, Greece, Okinawa, Japan, the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California, and folks on the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, they eat diets of mostly plants, minimally processed, drink water when thirsty. They're physically active. They tend not to smoke. They sleep enough. They're not stressed out. Strong social interactions. They have very diverse diets, low fat, high fat, exclusively plant, mostly plant, some fish and seafood, a bit of meat, lots of tubers. But they're all variants on the same theme. It's feet, forks, and fingers, sleep, stress, and love every time they routinely live to be 100 and don't get chronic disease. And if we're wondering whether or not we can transplant that, we have evidence that yes, we can transform culture to advance the human condition. North Karelia, Finland, was experiencing one of the highest rates of premature death and cardiovascular disease of any population in the world in the middle of the 20th century. Epidemiologists there launched a lifestyle intervention at the level of the whole community, focusing on tobacco cessation, reducing intake of saturated fat from animal foods, increasing intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, and lentils, physical activity, stress reduction, all the other good stuff. What happened? In 40 years in North Karelia, Finland, they have reduced rates of heart disease by 82% and added 10 years to average life expectancy. Lifestyle is the medicine, culture is the spoon, but with clinicians and epidemiologists at the tip of the spear leading the way. It's a vivid illustration to the rest of us of what is possible. I'd like it to happen everywhere, but my voice isn't loud enough. I don't get 29 million views. Even on your show isn't loud enough. There's so much noise, right? I mean, how many things on YouTube get millions of views, right? I mean, there's just so much noise. What do we do to have righteousness rise above the din and the discord? What do we do to have the confluence of science and sense be heard above the fractious bickering and the constant competition for our brief attention spans, the hyperbolic headlines? What do we do? Well, someone told us, an illustrious colleague, doctor, who published a paper in the peer-reviewed literature about a pachyderm named Horton. Do y'all know Horton? Who either had extraordinary auditory acuity or uncompensated schizophrenia. We've never been sure which. But one way or another, Horton was able to hear tiny little whoos living on a dust speck on this clover flower that nobody else could hear. And the whoos were going to be boiled in hazelnut oil. They dodged that grim and greasy fate by pulling together, pooling their voices, and all yelling at the exact same moment, "We are here." Is this sounding familiar, people? Okay. So the whoos were saved. Horton was a hero. We may presume everyone lived happily ever after. Our problem is not that we're here. Everybody knows we're here. We're a noisy, boisterous bunch. What they tend not to know about the public health community is that we agree that when it's time for lunch and nobody's looking, the paleo folks and the vegan folks eat mostly the same stuff. They pile their plates high with greens, and the paleos add the wild salmon, whereas the vegans add the lentils, but nobody's eating anything that glows in the dark. Honest, I've had lunch with these people. So I've asked them, are you willing to come together and tell the world exactly that? We can disagree about details, but the public deserves to know that we do not represent opposite ends of a competing spectrum. Rather, we agree about 80 to 90% of what everybody ought to do, and it's what we do ourselves. Let's tell them. And so I have created something called the True Health Initiative, committed to that very proposition. And the Council of Directors of the True Health Initiative, which has illustrious members in this very room, is now approximately 300 strong from 30 countries. And the beauty of it is not just the luminaries on it, people like Professor Egger and Jenny Brandmiller and others in this audience. Not just the fact that we have 3 former Surgeons General of the United States, the former chef to the Obamas, Sam Cass, many other luminaries, the science writer Mark Bittman, on and on it goes. The beauty of it, I think, is that we have some of the world's leading advocates for vegan diets, some of the world's leading experts in paleo diets on the same council saying the same thing. We need diets of mostly plants, minimally processed for the sake of people and the planet. Drink water when thirsty. And all the rest of that lifestyle stuff is good too. And we disagree about some details, but they're not even really worth talking about, but it's all our culture tends to talk about. We've got to get past the noise because it could make a world of difference. And so I end here back at a fork in the road. For far too long, at the level of our culture, we have let health languish along the road not traveled. We have the opportunity collectively, and only collectively, to put health on a path of lesser resistance. If we come together, if we rally around what we have long known, if we commit to translating knowledge into the power of routine action, both in our clinics and at the level of our culture, we can apply Archimedes' lever, those master levers of medical destiny. We can add years to lives. We can add life to years. We can protect this beautiful planet of ours. We can, in fact, achieve for public health and modern epidemiology something out of this world. Folks, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.